Hello, everyone. My name is Lucas Henry, and I am the Academic Programs Coordinator at the European Union Center at the University of Illinois, and also a PhD candidate in the Department of Musicology. I want to thank you all for coming to this conversation, and also a very hearty welcome to Jason Diakite, who is joining us all the way from Stockholm, Sweden. We are honored that he is joining us for this 19th edition of our EU Day celebration. Jason is one of the most successful Swedish musicians of his generation, enjoying nearly a 3-decade career under the stage name Timbuktu. He's released 12 full-length albums. That's correct, right? 12?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He's won 8 Swedish Grammy Awards, including ones for hip hop album and also for lyricist. And he's performed in venues all across the globe. And in addition to that, Jason's also an author, having written a well-received memoir titled In Drop of Midnight, which was translated into English and released in America last year as One Drop of Midnight. This memoir is an exploration of his family's histories in South Carolina and Harlem, his parents' migration to Sweden, where Jason was born, and his grappling with a complex identity all throughout his life as a performing musician and also just as a citizen of the world. So since the global outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, Jason has been busy producing a podcast titled This Moment with his friend and fellow Swede, Marcus Samuelsson, in which they discuss transatlantic issues and perspectives on the crossroads of race, music, food, politics, culture, and a whole host of other things. So welcome, Jason. It's great to have you here with
Thank you
us.
so much, Lucas. Thank you. I am so delighted to be here and be in conversation with you and connected from Stockholm, Sweden, all the way to Champaign, Illinois.
Yeah. Well, I want to also let everyone know that there is you should have a function to ask questions if you like, and you can do that through the Q&A or also I think through a chat as well. So please feel free to ask questions, and we will have some dedicated time at the end of the conversation to address, but please feel free to ask questions there in the moment as well. Okay, and why don't we get right into it? So what really drew our interest in inviting you to speak here are the conversations that you've been having right on your podcast, because they
All
are
right.
extremely salient right in the current
Mm,
moment. We are
mm.
I have been very excited in listening to them throughout the course of your right throughout the course of the podcast. And I guess the first question that I have is, how did you and Marcus decide that you wanted to do this, to enter this as a medium, right, for conversation?
Well, so in brief, I met Marcus at the Swedish Maritime Church in New York City in 1995. Marcus had just arrived to New York um, to do an internship at the Swedish restaurant Akvavit. Now he steps into the church. My dad was living in New York at the time, and I was living there with him. And he liked to go to the Swedish church to read Swedish newspapers and, meet other Swedes and kind of network and mingle. So we're sitting there, and this guy comes in, and my dad's like, that looks like a nice guy. You should go over and talk to him. You two could be friends. And I'm like, I'm very much or I'm very culturally a Swede in that way. Like I wouldn't go up and just strike up a conversation with a random stranger. Like, no way. My dad's like, oh, I'll go over and talk to him. My dad goes over and speaks to him for 5 minutes and then comes back, dangling a phone number. And he's like, well, now I have a new friend. Um, anyway, I ended up calling Marcus, and we became friends. And since, of course, that internship turned into so many more things. And Marcus has been based in New York City and now in Harlem since then. So going on 26 years. Throughout our friendship and, throughout the advent of podcasts, we've spoken about at some point we should start a podcast. As something you say in passing, wouldn't that be nice if we, but fast forward to 2020 and early March last year, I was in New York City. I had been I had been preparing for a year and a half to bring. So I wrote a book, a family memoir called The Drop of Midnight, and I turned it into a stage performance. Which is I wrote music to it and performed it together with a live band where I both tell stories and sing songs and kind of intermittently mix poetry, monologue, music, and rap. And I translated it to English, and my dream was to perform in New York. And I had been working on that for a year and a half, and had a theater called Harlem Stage. We were all ready to go, and we were only a few days from rehearsals getting started when it became clear to me that this is not going to work. This virus that we started hearing about 6 weeks ago in a city I'd never heard the name of before in China is a reality here in New York City right now, and it's going to disrupt all the plans that we had. So I actually had to jump on the last plane to leave New York for Stockholm on March 15th, it must have been, or 16th. Now, throughout me setting up the stage performance in English, and also on March 1st, A Drop of Midnight, the English version of my book, it was released March 1st on Amazon Crossings. So I was concurrently on a book tour and promoting the book and preparing for the stage performance that was set to premiere on March 30th. And Marcus was helping me. You know, Red Rooster is like my second home. Marcus's restaurant on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue in Harlem. And I've done book releases, performances. The band that I was using for my stage performance is one of the house bands at Red Rooster. And Marcus is just a champion and an ally and a big brother of mine. So he's been very close to this project and the different iterations of the story of A Drop of Midnight. Mm-hmm. But I had to just, pack up and leave, and ended up in this kind of in this void in Stockholm. And at the same time, Marcus was still in Harlem, and we were talking on the phone almost every day. And Marcus said, you know what, now's the time to start recording these conversations. And, maybe this is the moment where we actually get to doing that podcast that we've spoken about so many times. Mm-hmm. And Marcus said, I think it should be called This Moment, because this moment is just incredible and uncertain and scary. And, we need to talk, So that was how the podcast got started. Yeah. Now we ended up not first publishing until I think late May, right before the killing of George Floyd. We published the first episode. So we started recording in about the last weeks of March, and then used that time to kind of hone our skills and get our home studio setups and so forth. Right. And then by the time we were good to go, George Floyd had already been killed, and the need to ventilate, speak, unpack was layered with an even older kind of pandemic and pain that we both have experienced so much. So it just, the podcast was kind of a lifeline, I think, for both of us, just mentally moving through the summer and the fall.
Right. So, I mean, immediately following, the murder of George Floyd, right? It seems that like your podcast just became supercharged, right? With right, especially the way you were taking the conversation forward. And it's really quickly afterwards too that you have your first guest, right? The Kimberly Jones to come on and talk, right? And then that really seems to set forward like a continual, right, set of guests that really kind of give your podcast a trajectory too. Like, could you talk a little bit about that too?
Well, at first, at the outset, we thought it would just be the conversations between Marcus and myself. But after about a month, Marcus, we started calling friends and associates, a lot of them, and Marcus was calling people in Ethiopia. I was speaking to friends in Mozambique and South Africa, because what we, at that point in about April and May, we wanted to collect stories of how the pandemic was hitting.
Right.
How is the pandemic hitting, and maybe specifically how is the pandemic affecting the diaspora? So we started collecting these stories, and then of course, because it must have been end of May, we found out, the world found out about Ahmaud Arbery, and then George Floyd happened, and then that that delved us into, that brought up a lot of the Swedish issues, or the issues of being Black in Sweden, or being a person of color in Sweden, and at the same time, what's going on in the United States. I mean, the Black Lives Matter, again, I mean, it did in 2013 in its inception, echo around the world, but it went kind of truly global in no time. In no time, in the middle of a pandemic, there were demonstrations with 10,000 people shutting down the inner city of Stockholm. So the need to talk really was very great. And Marcus and myself, not being academics, not being the activists at the very forefront of this, needed and were curious about and needed to channel some of those people that were willing to speak with us about what was going on, to kind of guide us through that and share that wisdom. And also, Lucas, to expose Swedish audiences that, of course, the internet opens a vast array of avenues of collecting information, but still the Swedish media funnel is quite narrow still, as what narratives it gives to a broader Swedish public. And I figured, being able to lead a Swedish audience to somebody like a Kimberly Jones it's not a connection that would automatically happen for a kind of a broader swath of people in Sweden. So that was truly a gift. And Marcus, being who he is, and just a brilliant and social and wonderful and talented person that he is, has access to some very, very interesting people throughout his network. And we quite quickly decided to do the podcast in English so as to not limit it. As you may know, English is widely spoken and fully understood in Sweden, amongst the Swedish population. So it's not really an obstacle for Swedes to hear something in English. We're so used to it from the first TV we watch as kids is in English.
Right.
And at the same time, it gave us the chance to reach people in England, Kenya, China, the United States, obviously, Cuba, wherever, whoever has a internet can hear us.
Right. Are you able, this is just like actually kind of a technical question, I guess. Are you able to follow who is listening? Like, can you track the locations of people that are like downloading the episodes and things like that? And are you able to find out like what kind of reach you are having?
We can see rough stats. I know the people who work with our administrative, Marcus has a person, I have a person, they can see, like, for example, I know Spotify has great tools for being able to, like, so I have my music profile on Spotify, obviously.
Right.
That breaks down which cities people are listening. I see percentage breakdowns of which cities I have the most listens,
Right.
or most people clicking on my songs and on my profile and so forth. So you can get pretty complete stats about who's listening and where they are and
Right.
how often and for how long do they listen and so forth. So those stats, I mean, they've kind of they've ushered in a new era in the music business, at least in Sweden, because people go crazy for that data. At the same time, there are things that, as we say in Swedish, fall between the chairs of just looking at the numbers.
Right.
But yeah, no, we do have access to that.
Yeah. So do you feel like the like your main audience then maybe is in Sweden, but you definitely do have a global, like, do you feel like it's balanced too between maybe folks in the US and Sweden, since like this, you present this as a transatlantic conversation? Does the audience really feel transatlantic to you as well?
Not yet. I mean, the main listenership is in Sweden, but we're working on broadening it. And what everybody keeps telling us is that with podcasts, it takes time. And obviously, the landscape is if not saturated, there's a lot of choices for listeners to make between brilliant, brilliant journalists and thinkers and artists. And I mean, I get a lot of my intellectual food from that access that podcasts allows. So yeah, no, it's not a we're not where we want to be yet, but I do believe in the idea of, as we call the show, a transatlantic bridge, because Marcus is one of the very few people that I can really speak to about, having a deeper knowledge of what the United States and what American and Black American culture feels like, but at the same time being able to juxtapose that with Sweden and what Swedish culture feels like. And not very many people that I know have that intimate knowledge of both these places, so we can really share on another level, and obviously some of the earliest conversations we were having were the very clear differences in how the Swedish government was tackling the pandemic and how the American government was tackling the pandemic, and the question of just the cultural question of face masks, for example, and there's so much to look at, and just the differences of these two cultures, of which both Marcus and I belong, and at the same time, which is something we talk about, we have these kind of I was born in Sweden, but I grew up in the country I was born in, knowing and being reminded enough times for it to fully be internalized in me that I am an immigrant. I am not. I am the other here,
Right.
and it's still a lot to wrap my head around, because the fact that I was born here doesn't really make it doesn't change that otherness in the eyes of I would say Swedish society at large, at least to the experiences I've had for the past 40 years. But and at the same time, the United States has a different approach to immigration or immigrants, and is much more of an immigrant culture. So it's not that I'm regarded as an immigrant in the United States, but to myself, I know that I'm not fully rooted in American culture either. So I'm an immigrant in both places, and so is Marcus. And Marcus isn't even born in Sweden; he's born in Ethiopia. Marcus has this triple consciousness that he's so adept at interweaving in everything he does. I mean, you look at his food, and he'll
Mhm.
take Ethiopian injera and put Scandinavian gravlax and then serve it to people in Harlem. That conversation and that uh, fusion that his just whole person stands for, I find very, very inspiring. So a lot of that is what we talk about. And, and you have to stop me, Lucas, if I digress too much, but this not so subtle difference in the immigrant experience of people within the European Union who
Mhm.
are of non-European descent is the term second generation immigrant.
Mhm.
So, i.e., you may have arrived to Sweden at a young age or be born here like I was, but you are still called and labeled as, not only by yourself, but by society, as a second generation immigrant. Now, we haven't really gotten to the point. I'm not sure there is a third generation immigrant. I would say that would come down to what color skin you have or what religion you have, being the more visible your otherness is. I guess the higher the risk that you would have to, that even a third generation would have to carry that. Now, what we see in Europe among second generation immigrants is a rootlessness, a sense of disconnection from the country that you're in and the country that your descendants are from or your family is from. So you're not connected to the old home country, you're not connected to the new country. And I talk a lot about this in my book. This is
Mhm.
what I describe as in-betweenness,
Right.
or mellanförskap in Swedish. Uh, so that's something which is like just a very deep well for Marcus and I to fish out of, and
Right.
look into.
Yeah, I will say that your memoir really, really unpacks that quite a bit. I mean,
Mm,
almost from beginning to end, almost like every
mm,
single one of the little vignettes that you put in, because that's kind of
mm,
how I read the book, was that every chapter was a bit of another type of vignette that really
mm.
unpacks the complexity of like your own personal identity, and
Yeah.
that really does weave its way all the way through. And something else too that I've also noticed is that this weaves in and out of your music as
Mm, yeah.
well. I mean, like
Yeah.
I had been talking with some students leading up to this event, and we used your song "Mistanked," for
Thank
example,
you. I'm
as
so happy to hear that.
yeah. So
Have you then translated it to English?
well, so ja, talar lite svenska.
Oh, I didn't know you spoke Swedish, Lucas.
Yeah, well, I
Lite
learned it.
grann.
I learned it for my research, and unfortunately, getting back to something else that you had said earlier about like English being so now embedded into right into the Swedish experience. Swedes
Mm.
don't give me an opportunity to practice when I'm over there
Yeah,
researching. I'll say two or three words and they'll switch almost immediately into English.
yeah,
I mean, I
yeah,
guess for efficiency purposes, right?
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, but we have actually several students on campus who do
Mhm,
speak Swedish fluently. They are from Sweden, and I reached out for some help to get some more of the I guess like the on the ground cultural right translations of some of the
mhm,
things. So we worked on it together
mhm,
with that. But like specifically, right, you open up Mistanked by talking about the very thing that you had mentioned about like I think the translation is in Norway I'm Swedish, right, and in Sweden I'm a foreigner and
mhm,
utlander, right, or
mhm,
utlandisk is what you say.
mhm,
So
mhm.
I mean, could you,
It's something that so I've worked a lot in Norway. I've had the privilege to have a big following in Norway, um, and I would say that's my other musical kind of main territory is Sweden and Norway, more or less. Now, Norway is in this has this kind of little brother identity as it relates to Sweden. Sweden also, Norway was also a part of Sweden up until 1905 and in different times. And historically, the same kings have ruled the different countries in different times, and then other times they've been at war and so forth. So Norwegians are typically so open to Swedish culture that when in Norway, what they see the way I'm approached and kind of embraced in Norway is the first thing they see is my Swedishness,
Mhm.
and and on second or other place, is the color of my skin or my non-Europeanness, my obvious non-Europeanness, right? Whereas in Sweden, the country which I'm born, the first thing that's visible is my non-Europeanness, let's say. And then having spoken to so many of my Afro-Swedish friends who, are mathematicians or architects or engineers and can't get jobs, and very well educated, can't get employment that matches their education in Sweden, but in Norway they can. And after speaking to so many of my brothers and sisters over there and realizing that this is something that they all experience, that in Norway, their Swedishness trumps their skin color, and so a lot of people from here move there.
Yeah. Do you find that that's like something singular to Norway, or like do you find similar types of experiences in other parts of Europe as well?
Not the other Nordics don't have the same relationship to Sweden. I would say Denmark does not feel like it's the little brother of Sweden. I would say they, if anything, feel that they are the big brother. Also, Denmark and Sweden have been at war for most of the past millennium, more or less. They are not at war now, obviously. And I don't know, the Danes, Sweden didn't lift a finger to help them while they were occupied by Nazi Germany, nor did they to help the Norwegians, but they don't seem to hold that grudge. Finland is a whole different story because Finland was a Swedish colony. And also there's a clear linguistical barrier where, it's a Ugrian language. It's not a Germanic language. So there are some Finns that speak Swedish. There is a minority Finnish Swedish population, but I'd say the closest ties of the intra-Nordic kind of cultural closeness is between Norway and Sweden and Norway and Denmark.
Right.
Finland being its own, Iceland being very much its own.
Yeah. So, and I know that you perform, I mean, like almost exclusively in Swedish too, right? So do you,
Yeah.
that gives you mobility throughout Norway, but also, I mean, for performance through Denmark.
Yeah, I go to Denmark every now and then. I would say a lot of the subject matter I deal with in my music is not one of, there are these subtle yet clear cultural differences between the Nordic countries.
Right.
And without going, I mean, this is a whole discussion unto itself, but where the Danes, I would say, and now I'm really generalizing and really have to excuse me if there are any Danes listening, or, I would say that the sentiment that I've picked up over the past decade and a half is that Danes feel that Swedes are kind of inhibited by their political correctness and their anxiety to do the wrong thing. And Denmark, in my eyes, self-identifies as being free and past that. And I think all the Nordic countries had an idea of them being post-racial societies up until the early 2000s, I would say, when the popularity of right-wing extremist political parties, not just with the successes of these and the growth of these parties, was making it harder and harder to maintain the narrative of it being of racism not existing. But when I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and I would tell white Swedish people that I had experienced racism, there was such a I'd say the common denominator was shock, and they were like, but not here. Like, sure, in the United States, but not here in Sweden. And I'd say, yes, here in Sweden, in the small town of Lund, where we are right now, So Sweden and the Nordic countries they're in different phases of identity crisis, I would call it. Also, it's the realization of having been these culturally, ethnically homogenous societies, but now moving into and kind of into, after 25, 35 years on a kind of neoliberal expressway of a globalized economy, then they come out on the other side and they are actually multicultural societies. For all intents and purposes, the demographics have really shifted. Now, perspectives and identity and the traditions and so forth, of course, are lagging behind what the demographics look like. But so therefore, this is maybe a complicated answer to you. Therefore, Denmark has not been a country that has really widely embraced my music. I talk a lot about racism, and that's not a conversation that, at least until recently, has been one that's been held in the kind of public sphere in Denmark, nor has it in Norway.
Yeah. So do you have mobility throughout the rest of Europe as a performer too? I mean, like, do you perform outside of the Nordic countries?
To some extent. I mean, I guess I follow the migrating patterns of Swedes, right? So I'll show up at the Swedish Museum in Chicago, or I'll be in Barcelona or in London, where these pockets and Swedish exclaves, and then the Swedes will always bring some of their, Spanish or British or American friends or partners, to the show. But I would say that's mainly, and also I've been traveling a lot through sub-Saharan Africa, and then it's usually through different Swedish cultural programs and kind of development cooperations. For many years, I ran a music studio in Dakar in Senegal, teaching Senegalese, not really teaching them how to rap, but teaching them how to write songs, which was a very kind of, and I kept saying this to the kids that would come to these, to the workshops and to the classes, that in the case of maybe car manufacturing, or the amount of broadband that's laid in the ground, or in all these kind of industrial measuring means, Sweden is a highly developed country and Senegal is not. When it comes to culture, that balance totally shifts, because I was saying with just a flick of the eye, you are actually able to, you Senegalese teenager who's so good and is so fluent in your the way that you flow on a beat and dance, you can actually give cultural aid to this. Swedes are way behind you. Swedish kids are way behind you. I'm saying I'm helping Senegal give cultural aid to Sweden. So we ended up bringing Senegalese rappers to Sweden, and they perform in schools and so forth. So that was one of the types of projects that I was involved in, or have been involved in.
Yeah. So were they received well in the
very well. No, it's like soccer or football, it's such a universal language, music, that it's like, that you have a Swedish 16-year-old and a 16-year-old from a poor neighborhood in a poor country like Senegal. It's not a poor country, but an economically poor country, culturally extremely rich. and they have been listening to they have the same points of reference through hip hop culture,
Mm.
and the same points of, you know, and it's reflected in their fashion, and both kids know what a good rap flow sounds like, or what they like hearing, or what a good beat sounds like. So when it doesn't matter where you're from, if you show that you have that, then it's like respect is given immediately. And I love that kind of the more dynamic relationship than the static developmental perspective of the nation that gives and the nation that receives, and both nations are forever locked in these, you know, positions. Whereas you look at things like, you know, soft values like culture, and it all it shifts and is much more dynamic.
Mhm. Well, I guess this is somewhat of a related question where you were talking about
Mm.
points of reference. And so, what was it like to have Daryl McDaniels, DMC, on your
Wow.
show? Right? As I mean,
Yeah.
you and I are almost the same age, so we
Hmm.
very much
Hmm.
grew up with a lot of the same probably
Absolutely.
type of music. And I mean, Run DMC was one of the most famous
Yeah.
groups,
It's
right?
just like, it's like, yeah, you know, and he was so energetic,
Yeah,
right? You know, and I met him just like I'm meeting you, you know, with this, you know, I saw this part of him,
got
and
that much.
he was just jumping through the screen, and had, and you know, just had this knack. He's a storyteller, and also has this history of being the pioneer that he is, you know. So when he would break into old Run DMC rhymes, and
Right.
2 years ago a friend of mine asked me to say some MC, but you know, he'd break into stuff, and as a fan and as a devotee
Right.
of hip hop music, and somebody who fully identifies in hip hop culture, and you know, hip hop culture has made me uh, into who I am. It was just beautiful to be able to talk to him, and to listen to him, and it was really an honor to have him on.
Right.
I mean, a lot of, okay, Run DMC had, for being a hip hop group of the 80s, had like real tangible success. But a lot of the actual pioneers, you know, they pioneered this culture, this, you know, that started so as a local idiom, local custom, local
Mhm.
dances, uh, local way of using record players and words,
Right.
and having a what relationship they had to, uh, you know, the vamp of a James Brown song. But no, we're going to make a whole song out of that. Whereas I'm sure James Brown would say, but there's no way you can make a whole song out of just the end of the song, because you're missing the chorus and the
Right.
lead up to the chorus. And you
Yeah.
know, it goes against everything. But these these kind of this DIY culture that was so ultra local in New York City, uh, in at its inception, now is the most impactful uh, part of, it's just a pillar of global pop culture. Hip hop has permeated every facet of global pop culture in every country where there are human beings. You know, uh, if you're in Ethiopia, if you're in Vietnam, if you're in, you know, I'm sure there are Belarusian rappers right now thinking about how they can say stuff about Lukashenko. You know, I was just in conversation with a woman yesterday whose mother is from the DPRK, and she said there are rappers in the DPRK. Now, if there are rappers in places like North Korea, then you know that hip hop culture is everywhere. Um, and my point being that a lot of these pioneers that pioneered this, what today is a multi-billion-dollar industry, were never kind of, uh, they're they're not unsung heroes, but they're kind of unpaid heroes, you
Right.
know. So I think in every way that we can remember and reintroduce new generations to those that gave birth to this culture, I see as, you know, kind of my duty.
Right.
And to a lot of the kids that may listen to our podcast, or young people who don't have the relationship to Run DMC that you and I do, I see it as a gift to them to say, hey, you know what? When your parents were young, this is what hip hop sounded like, and this is one of the people who made it.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you have a list of dream guests that you want to have
Oh
on?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been actually trying to get KRS-One on the show. KRS-One and Rakim are two of them. Now there are, of course, dream guests, but a lot of times doing the podcast has also challenged my English a lot. Hey, there's your cat.
This is my assistant here.
Yeah. Does he or she is, so she's actually on the keyboard. He's on a keyboard now.
Well, I've moved my keyboard. I'm on a desk.
Yeah. He knows about it. He knows about it.
Yeah,
and he wanted to get in the frame. Yeah. But no, it's been challenging to speak to these, brilliant people like Nicole Hannah-Jones or Al Gore. And sometimes it just, I feel I normally like when we're talking right now, I feel totally free in speaking English, but sometimes it just, so there are dream guests that I'd love to speak to, like, for example, Cornel West, but I don't know if my, if I'd be able to carry a conversation like that. But I very much enjoy listening to him, for example.
Yeah. I have faith that you could do that. I would like to hear you, Lucas. With Cornel West.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you. And then there are, I was trying to get some Swedish politicians to come on the show, the Swedish Prime Minister and so forth, but whom I know, but we're in the middle of the pandemic, so we kind of got to wait until things, his workday eases up a bit. But there are a lot of people I'd like to speak to. Quincy Jones is another one. Yeah.
So I kind of want to pivot just a little bit too, right? And this is going back towards you had mentioned about your stage show, right? Which you performed that in Swedish first, right? There was a run of that before. How long did you run that?
It opened in 2017, and then it played for the fall season of 2017 in Stockholm, and for the spring season of 2018 in Malmo. And then for the fall, we did Gothenburg and 6 other cities in Sweden.
Yeah.
So it played for 3 seasons in Sweden. I played in Norway. We did Norway, the biggest cathedral in Scandinavia, in Trondheim. We played in the cathedral. We played at the Opera in Norway, the Royal Opera, and no performances in Denmark to date. And then I had done excerpt shows in DC and in Harlem, obviously, and was really gearing up to do the whole performance in English, where I translated all the music. So all the music was in English. I think I kept a few bars of one of the songs in Swedish, just to give an American audience a taste of what, rap in Swedish can sound like.
Yeah.
And hopefully, it is, so far as I know, we're planning on October, but how feasible that is and how realistic that is, who knows at this point.
Yeah. So, I mean, just now this is something that I didn't set you up for, right? But this is really kind of a technical question about performing like the same material between Swedish and English. So from my own experience, it doesn't necessarily always translate as rhythmically or smoothly. Like, how do you approach moving something that was originally and supremely crafted in Swedish into something that is has an equivalent in
it's performance? You have to, I mean, when I'm translating my own work, it's not as much of a problem because I can give myself whatever license I need. Like if I need to change the flow, then I do. If I need to exchange words that will ultimately change some of the meaning, then I do. You know, the actual linguistical translation of the stage performance script, which was about 38 pages, didn't take more than about 10 days. But the cultural translation, I had to enlist the help of a brilliant dramaturg named Jonathan McRory from the National Black Theater. And we, throughout the fall of 2019, would sit on Zoom and kind of discuss and look at the content and what I was saying and how, you know, what's relevant to a Swedish audience in this context. Is it what is relevant to an audience in the United States, or how do we say that in a different way? And that was far more complex. And I don't think I could have done that on my own. I needed somebody much more culturally rooted in not only American, but specifically African American culture to guide me through that. You know, I remember at when writing the book in Swedish, I obviously had to write about you know, from first to sixth grade, I was bullied by the same three boys more or less every day, and they used to, you know, they used to call me racist invectives, and it was a specific word that they and then there were derivatives of that word too, you know, derivatives of the N word in combination with other pejorative, you know, words. And I'm talking to my friend and saying, you know, I'm writing about this stuff. I have to write about, you know, because that was so formative to me. That's what kind of starts me along my path of internalized racism, was the at a tender age, between, especially, you know, maybe not so much when I was 7 or 8, but really when I was 9, 10, and 11, where I wanted nothing other than to fit in, blend in, not stick out, not be, you know, I wanted to be like everyone else. It was very painful to constantly be reminded that I was seen as something other, and also for a reason that I couldn't do anything about. You know, the color of my skin, even though, you know, I write about that in the book. I have a flaw, a pigmentation flaw, or a white spot on my right hand. And I used to sit and stare at it and, you know, kind of look at it and try to imagine what, you know, what my hand would look like if it was white. And I used to think, you know, well, what if the spot grows? You know, what if it grows? You know, underneath this brown, there's white, you know? So the bullying started me on this path of internalizing these experiences, and which is something that I'm still kind of decolonizing my mind from, and probably will be for the remainder of my days. So I had to write about it, and there was no way to write about it without using the words that I was called. And I would go back and forth with my friend who's an Afro Swede, and he's like, you can't, like, never reproduce that word, never, you know, reprint or utter the word, needs to die, you know. And I said, but there's no way of getting around it. Like, how can I express the specific pain of that word without using the word, even though it's, you know, as clearly implied as I can muster, you know, an N crossed over with all the following letters crossed over. So I ended up using it. And yeah, and I still feel that was the right thing to do. Now, when I was going to do the stage performance, I had to re-examine that decision because I was going to stand in a room many times in front of a predominantly white audience and say the word out loud, which to me was a whole different level. And I spoke with several friends whose advice and wisdom I trust about this, and ended up actually doing that, using the word, once in the stage performance. Now, something like that, for example, was what I brought to my American dramaturg, Jonathan, and said, what, and for him, he was like, oh, no, that's not a problem. You know, people say that all the time. You can say it, it's all right, because you are you can say it. Whereas the charge of that word in, or derivatives of that word in Swedish are a lot more, but it's just a lot more charged over here in a sense.
Jason, Lucas, I just wanted to jump in really quickly because we do have a lot of questions from the audience.
Yeah.
So would this be a good time?
I think
absolutely.
This would be great.
Okay, so the first question that we got actually ties directly to, Jason, what you were just talking about. So there are quite a few audience members who are teachers and researchers of Swedish language and culture based in the US. And they've been trying to find ways to make questions of identity and belonging part of their teaching. So how can everyone better address race in teaching, especially in a Northern European context?
How you can better address race in teaching in a specifically Northern European context? Well, I don't know if I don't know how to answer that question, really. I feel like, and this is where my English is failing me a bit, but let's call it racial reckoning, has yet to happen in Sweden itself, right? There has been an intense and steady blowback to the Black Lives Matter movement as it is being, as it's been translated to what it means to Afro-Swedes. From everything from liberal media, of course, and the further on the further to the right you go, the harsher that critique and resistance or attempts to delegitimize or trivialize, from everything saying like, well, you can't just, Swedish police don't shoot and kill Black people, so wanting to kind of trivialize the conversation that a lot of Afro-Swedish people and people of color in general in Sweden are trying to ignite on issues of structural racism, institutional racism, and the racist structures are global. They're so, they're a part of capitalism, and anywhere you have a market economy, you also have these racial stratifications in different versions of it, but kind of with a similar outcome, or I'd say with different outcomes, but built from the same source. So Sweden hasn't fully arrived at dealing with this demographical shift, with the fact that there are Afro-Swedes, there are Arab Swedes, there are Swedish people who are entitled to personhood in this country, but who are not being seen or recognized to this day. So I would say that this very roundabout attempt at answering that very difficult but very important question is to try to look at what race relations in the Nordic countries actually looks like today. And when you actually look at it, it's the idea of the social democratic utopia being one of peace and acceptance of all and egalitarianism and so forth doesn't necessarily include persons of color or the indigenous populations of both Norway, Sweden, and Finland. So that, let's be clear with that. That's something that's a way older kind of conflict that hasn't been dealt with either in the Nordic countries. So there is this other side of Scandinavian, of Nordic history and Nordic society that can be gleaned and told and can be that one can complicate a bit. So I guess having that conversation, I mean, it's also, if you were to have two students at your university, one who was an Iranian born but grew up in Stockholm, and one that was 72nd generation Swede that grew up in a small town like Borås, the equivalent of, let's say, Cincinnati or something. They would have two very different versions of what life in Sweden is like, but also what being a non-European Swede in Sweden is like. And even though that racial reckoning hasn't happened, we have had a renaissance of thinkers and academics, poets, musicians, journalists, authors, writing and starting to tell these stories. At the time when I wrote my book, which is only 5 years ago, you couldn't even fill out a quarter of a small bookshelf with books written by Black Swedes about the experience of being Black and Swedish in Sweden. Today, it has doubled in size just in 5 years. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing that intellectual awakening. Sorry for the very, very long answer.
Yeah, no worries. Actually, I've been reading through some of the other questions from the audience, and I found one that really piggybacks on to what you were saying, like in the immediate. It's a question from Barbara Williams. She says, "Thank you so much for your time today, Jason. That transition in the demographics in Sweden and the role language plays was the focus of my graduate work and graduate studies here at UIUC, in particular as represented in the works of Jonas Hassan Khemiri."
Yes,
right?
Yes.
She goes on and says, "Your episode with him felt like such a great, quote, barbershop moment. Do you feel like the BIPOC sense of community will continue to rise in its own trajectory in Sweden, independent of U.S. movements like Black Lives Matter?"
Absolutely, 100%, but not fully independent of American movements like Black Lives Matter, because just like American culture in general, and this may be, hard for Americans to fully realize, but the impact of American culture, I mean, be it McDonald's, be it, A$AP Rocky, or be it Bruce Willis or whatever, American culture has such a huge impact on global culture, and specifically on Sweden and the Nordic countries. We are so bright-eyed and open to any culture coming from the United States that African American music, in particular, has become kind of both the songs of struggle and the soliloquies of the entire diaspora. I mean, the way hip hop has affected, say, Nigerian artists, so that the iterations of Nigerian hip hop now are boomeranging back to Canadian artists like Drake. And we're seeing this, and this has happened, this happened with funk music, how James Brown affected Fela Kuti, who in turn affected, people in the United States. So, but I do think that we're having the conversations, we are writing the books, we are writing the articles, we are starting to make visible ourselves. My dad arrived in Sweden in 1970. He was a filmmaker and a law student, and is a human rights lawyer who's retired. Having been in Sweden only for 3 years, in 1973 he made the film The Invisible People, about foreign students at Lund University. Lund being a very small town in the south of Sweden, which is where I'm born, maybe comparable to an Oxford in England. Small town, big, second largest but oldest university in Sweden. I think it's the oldest. Uppsala might say that they are the oldest, but that's an ongoing rivalry. So that invisibility that he noticed within his first 3 years here as a Black man in Sweden, that invisibility has continued. And it is, I dare say now, in the past 5 to 6, 7 years, that we are starting to claim some of the public spaces and starting to build some of our own spaces. So yes, I definitely see this continuing, growing, and offering solace, inspiration, and energizing the next generation of thinkers, artists, dancers, playwrights, poets, academics.
Yeah. All right. We have several more questions, but
we can go on. Okay. It's 11 o'clock at night here. I have nowhere to go but to bed. So
well, it's also right at 4. So I want to take just a moment, because I know that some folks will need to leave. We can continue on with questions after this, but I want to take a moment just to talk about some of the other events that we have with the EU Day celebration that we've got, and then we'll get right back into the questions.
Absolutely.
So that if anyone needs to go, they can
absolutely
go on. So tomorrow we have tomorrow at noon, we have a keynote presentation by Karin Olofsdotter, the ambassador of Sweden to the United States. And she is going to be giving a lecture titled Rights, Representation, and Resources, Gender Equality in Sweden and the EU. And in this, she's going to talk about Sweden's particular approach to gender equality, how generous childcare and gender-neutral parental leave have benefited the GDP of Nordic countries, and then why women's access or equal access to rights, resources, and representation should be hard foreign policy concerns. And then next Friday, so because EU Day is no longer EU Day, it's more like EU Week at this point. Next Friday on March 5th at 2 p.m., we're having an interactive live performance of Aeschylus's ancient tragedy, The Suppliants, by the Out of Chaos theater troupe. And this tells the story of the Danaids, who fled their native Egypt to escape forced marriages. And arriving as refugees in Greece, they supplicate the gods and the king of the city of Argos, seeking refuge and a new home. There will be a post-performance discussion featuring a panel of speakers on the topics of refugees in Greece and the Mediterranean at large, on federal approaches to U.S. immigration, and on the work of local immigration activists here in Illinois. So if you want to find out more about each one of these events, you can go to our website, www.europe.illinois.edu, and follow the events page, or the pathway to that page. You can also register for the events there. We hope to see several of you who are here today at any or all of those other events. And so anyway, I also want to thank you, Jason, for talking with us today. This has been a vibrant conversation, I think. So
thank you so much for having me. I am overjoyed to be invited. Thank you for hosting this great event. And yeah, this is really inspiring, and to be able to reach all the way over to, back to the United States from Stockholm is always something that uplifts and energizes me.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, we really appreciate you being here. So I want to ask you a couple of more questions that came through here.
Yeah. And let me just say that, it's great that Ambassador Olofsdotter is coming on and also speaking specifically about Sweden's progress in gender equity, because that's something I often bring up in conversation in Sweden, is that the progress that has been made in gender equity in Sweden, and where Sweden has been very successful in, for example, today you will not have a music festival that doesn't have 50% female performers and 50% male performers. Now, this was not something that was legislated or needed to be legislated. This was a cultural shift that happened in no time. I mean, it happened over the course of a few years, from the first time that a festival said, well, no, we want to have 50% women and 50% men on stage at our festival, and some people reacting strangely to that, to it 3 years later not even being a conversation, everybody's doing it.
Right. Yeah. So
that really provides a roadmap for how other human rights issues could be approached, and other questions of representation could be approached. And I always offer that to people in Sweden who feel like complicating the journey to racial equity in Sweden by saying that this has been done before, and sexism is just patriarchy is just a branch, or maybe it's the trunk, but of the same tree of which racism grows off also.
I'm just saying, you are speaking right at my research, right? This is one of the things that I do, right, with my own work. I was at Way Out West in 2018. I actually saw you perform there.
Oh, wow. Yeah. We
was,
did a Drop of Midnight there too. It was the first festival that I did it.
I missed that one.
Yeah. But the show was way better. The regular show.
Were you? Did you perform in the cathedral? Is that where you did? Or the?
No, we did it at a small stage up on the hill.
Right.
And it was an experiment, seeing if we could do a show that demanded so much silence at a festival where there's not a lot of silence. We were able to do it, but it's definitely better to play loud music at a music festival.
Right. Yes. I saw a conversation on the gender equality issue by Key Change there, and it was. But with Way Out West, what I found so interesting with that was that the folks, as they have the panels at the industry conferences, about 50-50 gender equality. Anytime someone says that's going to be so hard to do, the folks from Way Out West and Iceland Airwaves and both, they just go, we've been doing it for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with like the vegan aspect of that festival too. We've been doing this under the radar for 10 years and you didn't even notice, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's one of the things that, like what you're talking about, these things all provide roadmaps for other forms.
And that's why I see it as inevitable that that the representation of non-European Swedes in more facets of Swedish life, those kind of floodgates, that those doors have to be opened, just as they were for women,
Right. Yeah. So
yes, let's dive in.
No, it's fine. But we're really looking forward to the ambassador's talk tomorrow. And
she's fantastic, and please give her my regards.
Okay, I will. It's the event's public. Please feel free to register if you want to come and listen to her.
It's at noon?
It's at noon, which would be
it would be 7 o'clock
right?
In the evening. If I can make it, I'll be here, definitely.
All right, cool. All right, so I want to. There's another question here that came through that I thought would be really good to hear your thoughts on. So Sania Ganui asks, in A Drop of Midnight, you write openly about searching for, quote, home and recognizing multiple homes, right? It seems that has a deeper meaning than belonging or acceptance. for example. Can you speak more about the importance of homes in, quotation for you, in American and Swedish contexts?
Yeah, it's I don't know if it's something that is especially present in the so present in the immigrant experience. And I spoke before about me not physically actually having immigrated to Sweden, but being seen as an immigrant. But also in a sense, I was raised by immigrants. So in a sense, I've also inherited an immigrant perspective of, conversations of, well, the Swedes do this and the Swedes do that. And when you're in this country, you can't do X, Y, and Z. So there was, from as far back as I can remember, even in my home, a clear difference between them and us, right? Because that's how my father saw it. That's how my mom saw it. Whereas my story was a little different because, Swedish is their third and fourth language, but it's not a language that they have full mastery of and so forth, whereas I do. And they don't, even though they've lived in Sweden for 50 plus years, they're still very American at heart, I would say. My mom's in the supermarket talking to strangers, involving people in whatever she's doing. She's very un-Swedish in her social manner. And that's having been here for 5 decades. So I spent a lot of time as a kid wondering thinking about home as a country, like, what is my home country? I don't feel at home in Sweden. And I'm also often reminded by other Swedes that this is not my home, or my home must be somewhere else, because where are you actually from? And also knowing that, well, home is not, the United States is not my home country, but I can imagine that it is. But every time I go there, I feel very Swedish. That then having, I think, and my parents got divorced when I was 1. My concept of home was, is home my mom's house, or is it my dad's apartment? So home has been, and home, my dad always speaks of home. And
Right.
when he speaks of home, I know what he means. He's talking about Harlem. I think he's not only specifically talking about Harlem, he's talking about certain people.
Right.
Certain people in the hometown that he left, that he remembers, and those that are alive that remember him. That's the only part of home that it lives inside of him. So we have, home living inside of us. And there's just these clear differences between being the child of immigrants and being an immigrant yourself. I don't have that, because to me, if I think of hometown, in a sense, that's Lund, and that's the specific neighborhood where my dad lives, which feels geographically most like my home. Today, I have a small child and a partner. I would say those two people are home to me. Even if we're in a hotel room, or if we're at, somebody else's house, or in another country, it is with them I am home.
Right.
The home maybe having evolved to something that is when the most intimate level of sharing is home,
Right.
or something.
Is
It's definitely a concept that I've thought a lot about and talk a lot about with people who share similar kind of backgrounds as myself.
Yeah. Does your family get to travel with you when you go? And when you mentioned having them in hotels, I know that you were in New York for a while in March. Were they with you?
Yeah. Well, they were supposed to come on, so I left New York on March 15th, landed in Sweden March 16th. They were supposed to land in New York on March 17th.
Oh, wow.
But so the reason we had to the reason we had to cancel the show at the very time we did is because the president issued a travel ban, like no EU, like travelers from the EU were not allowed to enter the United States. And we had the composer coming from Sweden. We had the illustrator also coming from Sweden. And then, of course, my partner and my daughter, who are also coming from Sweden. And well, without the illustrator and the composer, we couldn't do the show. And well, I didn't want to be stuck in New York City and not be able to get back to my family. I was talking to my partner about her coming over, even though we wouldn't be able to do the show. But then we deemed it like, well, it might not be great to be stuck in an Airbnb somewhere in New York City for an uncertain amount of time. And in retrospect, yeah, I think I did the right thing by going back to Sweden. So yeah, I do bring them as along as much as I can, but also we just travel, non-work related travel, or pre-pandemic we traveled a lot. Hard to say if and when we'll be able to get back to that, but
yeah. All right, and I think I've got one more question.
Okay, great, Lucas.
And this is from Zuzana Fayal, who teaches in the French and Italian department here in at the university. She says, "Thank you for this great conversation. Jason, I wonder how your multilingualism is reflected in the languages that you use in your music and in your everyday life. Right? What are the tensions, if any, that you see, and how do you negotiate them if you do? Like, I know you've talked a little bit about this already, but I wonder if there were some other things you wanted to."
I think the reason that I love writing in Swedish is because it's my second language. So I essentially didn't learn Swedish until my parents got divorced when I was very young. And then eventually my mom met and fell in love with the Swedish man. He actually taught me Swedish, and I didn't fully learn Swedish without it. I had a heavy accent if I listened to old cassette tapes of, that my parents recorded when I was a kid, because they spoke English and they were living in this little university town. Their friends were all foreign students from South America, Asia, Africa, the United States, or other European countries. Very few kind of native Swedes. So the lingua franca for those in their community was English. So they managed to maintain this kind of English speaking culture, even though they were in this very distant and non-English speaking land. But I think the reason I love writing in Swedish is because I have this kind of healthy, not disrespect of it, but it's very pliable to my needs. It's also a very it's a very pragmatic language.
Yeah.
The essence of, and I think this goes for all the Nordic languages, is that they're very, there's an innate truthfulness in them. Swedish doesn't have as many adjectives as English does. It's harder to be vague, veiled, abstract, and surreal in Swedish. If you say something in Swedish, if you tell me, you should really call me next week. We should talk because there's we could do some other work and blah, blah, blah. That, if you said that to me in Swedish, I'd be like, yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I'd love to do that. And I'll actually call you next week.
Right.
An experience that I learned living in New York and traveling to New York as when I was younger was that when people in New York say, yeah, you should call me, we should talk, we should work together. Right. It doesn't really mean that I literally should pick up the phone and call them several days later when they've forgotten. It means right. I'm having a good time. Yeah, I'm having a good time right now. And like another friend of mine said, Jason, you really got to stop using the word interesting. You keep saying things are interesting all the time. When people say interesting in New York, it means they're bored. I don't know how true that is. I'm like, wow, but how do you express when something is interesting, you know? Um,
Mhm.
so Swedish is very pragmatic, and also Swedish is very open to what we call borrowed words, låneord. Swedish contains German words, French words, English words, and today Turkish words, Arabic words, Iranian words that are kind of woven into the Swedish language because of it being a small language. And I
Mhm.
love that about Swedish, and that I can uh, mold it and remold. I can say something, I can say a whole sentence in English, but in Swedish. I don't know if that makes any sense. I can't do it vice versa. When I
Mhm.
wrote my book in Swedish, it contains lots of English because all the conversations I was having in English with my father, his friends, my relatives,
Mhm.
I was able to keep intact in English, yet to a Swedish audience, they'll read the Swedish sentences and then the English sentences seamlessly and back to the Swedish. It's not, it's an uninterrupted by it
Mhm.
actually being a different language. So Swedish it serves a high function as a language to write songs in, I think. And
Yeah.
of course, so does English. It's just that I feel my command of it isn't great enough. The tensions of it are, I don't know if there are any tensions of it, you know. I think the tensions are the fact that I could speak circles around my parents in Swedish, and I could understand things in Swedish at a much faster rate than they could. I could understand, you know, if the principal of my school called my mother to tell her that I'd been doing something, she might not grasp the entirety of what he was saying, but I did, you know. And I could explain to her, no, but what he means is that, no, it's just that, you know, I could I could navigate the Swedish language in a way that my parents couldn't, which made me more adept at understanding Swedish society at a quicker rate than they could. Um, I don't know if that ever resulted in any direct tension, but it resulted in a clear difference in how we live in this country.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, back to the music, I imagine that the directness and the efficiency of the language actually kind of even empowers the messages that you want to say in
Yeah,
the music too. That you know, would you agree with that? Or
absolutely, absolutely. That's why I shifted to Swedish, because that directness was so it was so it became so clear to me because all through the 90s I rapped in English, but
Mhm.
about 98 I started writing some lyrics in Swedish, and I'd perform, you know, most of my material at a performance would be in English, but then I'd start doing like one or two things in Swedish, and that would just like instantly translate to the audience in a whole different way. And once I found out I could start writing about, you know, social observations and talk about racism or talk about, you know, my family or my friends, it actually just notched up. It gave it a higher meaning because,
Right.
you know, people would see themselves in that. They'd come and talk to me about it. I'd have conversations about it, or people would disagree with what I was saying. It just um, it
Right.
was just that just the directness of it. I love, you know.
Yeah.
I was actually sitting in my mom's kitchen um, one day many years ago, about 20 years ago, and I just read Michael Moore's book, Stupid White Men, I think it was called. And chapter 4 of that book, I think it was called Dear George. And it's written like the whole chapter is written like a letter to then President George W. Bush. And I was like, wow, I wonder if I wrote a rap song, like if I write a rap, a track, um, as a letter to the Swedish Prime Minister at the time, Göran Persson. You know, I know that the song would be played on Swedish radio. I know it would be played on Swedish, you know, music television that still
Mm.
existed at the time. Chances are that he'd hear it. Like I'd be able to speak to him
Right.
and say the things that I'm feeling. So I said, well, okay, not easy to write a letter in rap form, but I started with the first verse, and it's like, okay, I got that. Then managed to find a second verse, and then managed to compose a third verse. And then I was like, okay, but there's no way I'm going to be able to write a chorus for it. But I actually managed to get some form of a chorus together, and it became a track. And I released it as the first single of my album called The Botten is Nord in 2003. And yeah, and he not only did he hear it, journalists were calling the prime minister's press secretary, asking him what he thought about it. And a few months later, he answered it. And so it really, which was awesome to me, for me to see what, how communicative that was, from my mom's kitchen. I could reach out in that way.
Right. I mean, it really speaks to what Chuck D said, right? About the strongest thing about hip hop is the soapbox.
Yep. It is, because everyone can get one, and it's just get up there and speak your mind, speak your heart, and that's really one of the magnetic forces of hip hop culture, which makes it so translatable to Eritrean culture or Russian culture or Chinese culture, where it's molded and kind of franchised into its local iteration and version of it. And now you have these hip hop franchises in every country of the world talking about those specific issues with those specific artists, some of them even having their specific sounds, even though unfortunately in a very broad extent still trying to emulate a lot of what's coming out of the United States, but that's very understandable at the same time. But I usually say that hip hop is in more countries than McDonald's. It's a way more successful American franchise than McDonald's, and McDonald's has done pretty well.
Right.
Hip hop is the true Happy Meal.
Yeah. It sounds like you have something marketable there with
It
McDonald's.
doesn't come with any toys, but yeah.
Well, the music is the toy, I think.
The music is the toy.
That's the thing that everyone
The
will be
toy, it's
ordering
the
it for.
cheese, it's the bun, it's the Coke, it's everything.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, really, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. And
thank you, sir. This was really lovely conversing with you, and I hope we get a chance to do it again, Lucas. And
yeah,
and also let me just give you a tip, because the guy was telling you before we started the conversation, Professor Ryan Skinner at Ohio State. He's also a musicologist. I'm sure you and him will. I'll put you guys together on email.
Yeah, please do.
I'm sure you guys will have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, please do.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. Good luck with the rest of EU week. And yeah, hope to see you in Champaign at some point.
Absolutely. We would love to host you here.
All right.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Peace.